I'll pay you $10,000 if you pretend to be my bride tonight." The words hung in the air like something out of a movie, completely out of place in the dimly lit bar on the edge of Manhattan's Lower East Side. Sophie Bennett blinked slowly, certain she had misheard the man standing in front of her. The neon beer sign above the counter buzzed faintly, casting a soft blue glow across the scratched wooden surface she had been wiping for the past hour. Outside, a cold November wind pushed through the streets, rattling the windows and carrying the distant sound of traffic and late-night laughter. It had been a long shift already, and Sophie's feet ached in her worn sneakers, the kind you buy on clearance because rent comes first and everything else comes later. She tucked a loose strand of chestnut hair behind her ear and studied the stranger carefully. He didn't belong here. Everything about him made that obvious. His charcoal coat looked tailored, the kind that probably cost more than her entire month's paycheck. His watch caught the bar's dim light with every small movement of his wrist. Even the way he stood, calm, composed, almost too confident, felt completely out of place in a neighborhood bar that served $2 coffee refills and late-night burgers. "I'm sorry," Sophie said slowly, her voice cautious but polite. "Did you just say bride?" The man nodded once. His expression remained steady, as if he were discussing a routine business deal instead of the strangest request Sophie had ever heard. "Just for one night," he clarified. "A few hours, technically." Sophie let out a small laugh, the kind people make when something is too ridiculous to process. "Yeah, I think you've got the wrong girl." But the man didn't laugh. He simply reached into the inside pocket of his coat and placed a small white envelope on the counter between them. The paper slid across the polished wood until it stopped near Sophie's hand. "My name is Daniel Carter," he said calmly. The name meant nothing to her at first, but the tone in his voice suggested it probably should have. "And tonight, I need someone who can convince an entire room of powerful people that she's about to marry me." Sophie stared at the envelope but didn't touch it. Her heart began to beat a little faster, though she couldn't say why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the quiet certainty in his voice. "Why me?" she asked. Daniel glanced around the bar for a moment, taking in the chipped stools, the old jukebox humming quietly in the corner, the handful of late-night regulars barely paying attention. Then his eyes returned to her. "Because you look like someone who doesn't belong in my world," he said simply. "And tonight, that's exactly what I need." Sophie finally picked up the envelope. Inside was a check. Her breath caught the moment she saw the number written across the center. $10,000. Her mind instantly raced through 100 thoughts. Rent overdue by 2 weeks. Her mother's medical bills sitting unpaid on the kitchen table. The second job interview she had lost earlier that morning. $10,000 could fix things. Not forever, but long enough to breathe again. Sophie looked back up at Daniel, her pulse louder now in her ears. "You're serious?" "Completely." He paused, studying her expression as if measuring something deeper than her answer. "The gala starts in 2 hours. Sophie hesitated. Everything about this situation felt impossible. A stranger. A fake bride. A room full of people she would never normally meet. And yet something about the moment felt strangely unreal, like one of those turning points people only recognize years later. She folded the check slowly and set it back inside the envelope. "Okay," she said quietly. Daniel's eyebrow lifted slightly, surprised at how quickly she answered. Sophie met his gaze, determination flickering behind her tired eyes. "But if I'm going to pretend to be someone's bride," she added, "you're going to have to tell me exactly what kind of world I'm walking into." And for the first time since entering the bar, Daniel Carter smiled. The wind outside had grown colder by the time Sophie Bennett stepped out of the bar and onto the sidewalk beside Daniel Carter, the city lights reflecting across rain-damp pavement, while a sleek black sedan waited quietly at the curb like it had been there all night just for him. Sophie wrapped her thin jacket tighter around herself, suddenly aware of how different she must look standing next to a man whose world clearly ran on polished marble floors and private elevators. Daniel opened the car door with the calm precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, and Sophie hesitated for only a moment before climbing inside. The leather seat felt impossibly soft compared to the cracked vinyl stools back at the bar. As the car pulled into traffic, Sophie watched the city pass by through the window, neon lights and yellow taxis blurring into streaks of color. "All right," she said finally, turning toward him. You said a room full of powerful people. What exactly does that mean? Daniel folded his hands loosely in his lap. Tonight is the Carter Foundation Winter Gala, he explained. 500 guests. Investors, board members, journalists, and a few families who believe they control my future. Sophie raised an eyebrow. That sounds intense. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. It usually is. The car stopped at a red light, and Sophie studied his face more carefully now. Earlier she had only noticed that he was handsome in the distant, magazine cover sort of way that belonged to another world. Now she noticed the quiet fatigue behind his eyes, the kind that came from carrying responsibility too long. So why do you need a bride tonight? She asked. Daniel looked out the window for a moment before answering. Because my board of directors believes stability is important for leadership. And according to them, stability means I should marry someone from a very specific family. Sophie leaned back slightly. Let me guess. Rich. Famous. Probably owns half the city. Close, Daniel said calmly. Her father owns the other half. Sophie laughed under her breath. And you are trying to avoid that. I am trying to avoid losing control of the company my father built. The car moved again, weaving through evening traffic. Sophie turned back toward the window, absorbing the weight of what he had just said. This was not some rich man playing a strange game. This was a man trapped in expectations he never asked for. So you show up with a bride, she said slowly, piecing it together. And suddenly everyone has to rethink their plans. Daniel nodded once. Exactly. Sophie looked down at her hands resting in her lap. They were rough from years of work, from carrying trays and cleaning counters, and living a life that had never come with shortcuts. You still have not answered my question, she said quietly. Why me? Daniel studied her again, just as he had inside the bar. Because you did not recognize my name, he said. Because you did not treat me like a headline or a bank account. His voice softened slightly. And because when I walked into that bar, you were the only person in the room who looked like you still believed kindness mattered. Sophie felt something unexpected tighten in her chest at those words. She had not thought about kindness in a long time. Life had a way of pushing those ideas aside when bills piled up and hope grew thin. The car turned onto a wider avenue now, skyscrapers rising higher with every block. Finally Sophie spoke again. All right, Mr. Carter, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Tell me one thing before we get there. Daniel waited. Sophie met his eyes directly. If I am going to pretend to be your bride tonight, what kind of man am I pretending to love? For the first time since they left the bar, Daniel did not answer right away. Daniel Carter finally answered only after the sedan turned onto Park Avenue, where the buildings rose like silent towers of glass and steel above the glowing streets. You are pretending to love a man who built a company when he was 26 years old, he said calmly. A man who learned very early that success attracts many allies and very few friends. Sophie studied his face as the city lights moved across the window behind him. There was no arrogance in his tone. If anything, it sounded more like quiet honesty. That sounds lonely, she said before she could stop herself. Daniel gave a faint shrug. It can be. The car slowed in front of a tall building made entirely of polished glass, its entrance framed by warm golden lights and uniformed staff waiting beneath a large canopy. Sophie stared upward. The place looked less like a hotel and more like something out of a movie premiere. We are not going inside the gala yet, Daniel explained. First we have about 90 minutes to make sure you do not look like you came straight from a neighborhood bar. Sophie glanced down at her faded jeans and scuffed sneakers. That might take a miracle. Daniel opened the car door and stepped out, then offered his hand to help her. Fortunately, he said with a small smile, miracles can be arranged. Inside the building, the lobby smelled faintly of fresh flowers and polished wood. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling so high Sophie felt dizzy looking up. A woman in an elegant black suit approached them quickly, carrying a tablet and wearing the confident expression of someone used to handling impossible schedules. Good evening, Mr. Carter, she said smoothly. Everything is ready upstairs. Daniel nodded once. Thank you, Olivia. Sophie followed them toward a private elevator, her shoes echoing softly across the marble floor. She had spent her entire life in places where people rushed and shouted and bumped into each other. Here everything moved quietly, like a carefully choreographed dance. When the elevator doors opened again, they stepped into a spacious penthouse suite filled with clothing racks, makeup mirrors, and several assistants who immediately turned their attention towards Sophie. She froze. "Wait," she said softly, glancing at Daniel. "What is all this?" "Preparation," he replied simply. One of the stylists gently guided Sophie toward a chair near a large mirror framed with bright lights. Another assistant rolled in a rack of gowns, each one more elegant than anything Sophie had ever seen in person. Silk, satin, delicate fabrics that seemed to shimmer with every movement. Sophie stared at the dresses, her mind struggling to catch up with the reality unfolding around her. "You are serious about this," she murmured. Daniel stood nearby, watching quietly. "Tonight, everyone must believe you belong beside me." Sophie looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her hair was slightly messy from the wind outside, and the thin jacket she wore suddenly looked even older under the bright lights. For a moment doubt crept into her voice. What if they see right through me? Daniel stepped closer, his tone calm but certain. "They will not." Sophie looked up at him through the mirror. "How can you be so sure?" Daniel met her eyes steadily. "Because confidence convinces people faster than wealth ever could." One of the stylists lifted a long white gown from the rack and held it up carefully. The fabric flowed like liquid light under the room's bright lamps. Sophie turned slowly in the chair, staring at it in disbelief. "You expect me to wear that?" she asked. Daniel nodded once. "Tonight," he said quietly, "you are not the girl from the bar anymore." He paused for a moment, studying her reflection as if seeing something others had overlooked. "Tonight," he added softly, "you are the woman the world believes I chose to marry." Sophie Bennett had never seen so many people working on one person at the same time. Within minutes, the quiet penthouse suite transformed into a careful storm of movement. One stylist gently lifted sections of her hair, while another adjusted warm lights around the mirror. Someone else measured the length of the white gown against her shoulders, while another assistant placed elegant shoes on the floor beside the chair. Sophie sat perfectly still, afraid that even breathing too fast might break something in the delicate moment. In the mirror, she could see Daniel Carter standing a few feet behind her, calm and patient while the room worked around them. He looked completely comfortable here, as if this world had been waiting for him his entire life. Sophie wondered what it must feel like to grow up believing you belonged in places like this. One of the stylists carefully brushed Sophie's hair back from her face and smiled softly. "You have beautiful features," she said kindly. "We are just helping the world notice them." Sophie gave a nervous laugh. "The world has never noticed me before." The stylist tilted her head slightly while studying Sophie's reflection. "Then the world has been looking in the wrong direction." Daniel said nothing, but his eyes remained quietly focused on the mirror. The makeup artist stepped forward next, moving with careful precision as she applied subtle touches that brightened Sophie's tired eyes and softened the faint lines of stress that long work shifts had left behind. Sophie barely recognized the girl staring back at her reflection now. The exhaustion that usually lived in her expression had faded. In its place was something calmer, something brighter. As the final touches were completed, one assistant carefully helped Sophie step into the long white gown. The fabric flowed smoothly over her shoulders and down toward the floor, catching the light in soft waves of silver and ivory. When Sophie stood up fully, the room grew quiet for a moment. Even the stylist seemed slightly surprised by the transformation they had just created. Sophie slowly turned toward the mirror again. For several seconds, she simply stared. The woman reflected in the glass looked confident, graceful, almost regal. She looked like someone who had spent her life attending galas and charity dinners instead of late-night bar shifts and early morning bus rides. Sophie lifted one hand carefully, touching the smooth fabric near her waist as if confirming it was real. "This cannot be me," she whispered softly. Behind her, Daniel finally stepped forward. His voice remained calm, but something thoughtful moved behind his eyes as he looked at her reflection. "It always was," he said quietly. Sophie turned toward him slowly, unsure whether to laugh or argue. "You are seeing the dress," she replied. "Anyone would look different wearing something like this." Daniel shook his head slightly. "The dress helps," he admitted. "But confidence is what people will notice." Sophie looked down at the elegant shoes waiting near her feet and hesitated. "I'm not sure I have that kind of confidence." Daniel extended his hand to help her step forward. "Then borrow mine tonight," he said. Sophie placed her hand in his, surprised by how steady his grip felt. When she slipped into the shoes and stood again, the mirror reflected a completely different version of the girl who had walked into the bar earlier that evening. For the first time since this strange night had begun, Sophie felt something unexpected rising inside her chest. It was not fear. It was not doubt. It was possibility. Daniel studied her quietly for one more moment before speaking again. "The gala begins in 30 minutes, he said. "Are you ready to meet the world that believes you are about to become Mrs. Carter?" Sophie took a slow breath while looking at the woman in the mirror one last time. Then she turned toward the door, her voice steadier than she expected. "Let us see if they believe it." The elevator doors opened directly into a quiet marble hallway that led toward the grand ballroom, where the Carter Foundation Winter Gala had already begun. Soft music drifted through the air ahead of them, a smooth orchestra melody mixed with the low hum of hundreds of conversations. Sophie Bennett slowed her steps for a moment as she walked beside Daniel Carter, her hand resting lightly on his arm the way the stylist had shown her only minutes earlier. The polished marble floor reflected the glow of golden chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling, and every step forward felt like walking deeper into a completely different life. At the end of the hallway, two tall doors stood open, revealing the ballroom beyond. Sophie stopped just before crossing the threshold. Inside the room, hundreds of guests moved gracefully across the floor, dressed in elegant gowns and tailored suits. Crystal glasses caught the light as waiters carried trays of sparkling drinks between clusters of business leaders, journalists, and investors. A large banner near the stage displayed the name Carter Foundation in silver lettering against a dark blue background. Sophie inhaled slowly, her heart beating faster as the reality of the moment settled over her. "There are more people here than in my entire neighborhood," she whispered quietly. Daniel leaned slightly closer, so only she could hear his voice. "Remember what I told you," he said calmly. "Confidence convinces people." Sophie nodded once, though she could still feel the nervous flutter in her chest. Together they stepped into the ballroom. For a moment no one seemed to notice them. Conversations continued, glasses clinked softly, and the orchestra played on. Then slowly, like a ripple spreading across water, heads began to turn. First a few curious glances, then quiet whispers. Sophie could feel the shift happening in real time as people recognized Daniel Carter entering the gala. A tall man near the center of the room paused mid-conversation, his eyes narrowing slightly as he noticed the woman walking beside the billionaire CEO. Another guest leaned toward a friend and murmured something behind his hand. Sophie felt every pair of eyes landing on her gown, her posture, her presence beside Daniel. The attention was overwhelming, but she forced herself to stand a little taller just as Daniel had suggested earlier. Daniel guided her calmly through the crowd as several guests approached to greet him. "Daniel," one older investor said with surprise in his voice. "We did not expect you tonight." Daniel smiled politely. "I rarely miss my own foundation events." The man then glanced toward Sophie, curiosity clearly written across his face. "And you must be?" Sophie felt the room grow slightly quieter around them. She remembered Daniel's instructions, lifted her chin gently, and offered a calm smile. "Sophie Bennett," she said warmly. "Daniel's fiancée." For half a second the man blinked in surprise. Then his expression quickly shifted into polite congratulations. "Well," he said with a short laugh, "that certainly explains the rumors we have been hearing tonight." Sophie caught Daniel's brief sideways glance, and for the first time since they had entered the ballroom, she saw something unexpected in his expression. Approval. They continued walking deeper into the crowd as more guests noticed them. Some offered friendly greetings. Others whispered quietly behind raised glasses. But the most surprising reaction came from the room itself. Instead of skepticism or judgment, the guests seemed captivated. Sophie moved naturally beside Daniel, answering questions with quiet confidence and offering small smiles that made every introduction feel genuine. At one point, a young server accidentally bumped into her while passing with a tray of drinks. The server froze in embarrassment, clearly expecting anger from someone dressed like a millionaire bride. Instead, Sophie gently steadied the tray and smiled kindly. "It is all right," she said softly. "Long night." The server nodded nervously. "Yes, ma'am." Sophie gave a small, reassuring smile. "You are doing great." Daniel watched the exchange without speaking, but something thoughtful moved behind his eyes again. Across the ballroom, several board members stood near the stage, observing the scene carefully. One of them leaned toward another and whispered, "I thought the marriage arrangement with the Harrison family was already decided." The second man shook his head slowly. Apparently Daniel Carter had other plans. Meanwhile, Sophie continued walking beside Daniel, unaware that with every graceful step, she was quietly changing the expectations of everyone in that room. Daniel Carter noticed the change before anyone else did. It happened slowly, almost invisibly, like the subtle shift in a room when the music changes and no one immediately realizes why the atmosphere feels different. At first, Sophie Bennett had simply been the mysterious woman beside him, the unexpected fiancée who disrupted the assumptions of the evening. But as the minutes passed, something else began to happen. People were not just looking at her. They were listening to her. Daniel stood beside her while a small group of donors discussed a new community education program the foundation planned to fund next year. Normally, these conversations were predictable, full of polite nods and carefully rehearsed enthusiasm. Yet when Sophie quietly asked a simple question, the entire tone shifted. "How many students will actually receive the scholarships?" she asked gently. The donors exchanged glances before answering. "We are hoping for about 100 next year," one of them explained. Sophie nodded thoughtfully. That could change a lot of lives. Her voice was calm, but sincere in a way Daniel rarely heard at these events. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply speaking from the heart. Daniel noticed the donors smiling back at her, clearly appreciating the genuine interest. As the group drifted away toward the dining table, Sophie turned slightly toward Daniel with a quiet breath of relief. "Was that convincing enough?" she asked softly. Daniel studied her for a moment before answering. "You did not sound like someone pretending," he said. Sophie gave a small laugh. "Good. Because I am not very good at pretending." The orchestra music shifted to a softer melody while guests moved slowly across the ballroom floor. Daniel glanced toward the tall glass doors that led to a private balcony overlooking the city skyline. "Come with me for a moment," he said quietly. Sophie followed him outside, where the cool night air immediately felt refreshing after the warmth of the crowded ballroom. The balcony offered a breathtaking view of Manhattan stretching for miles beneath the stars. Thousands of lights glowed across the skyline like scattered constellations. Sophie stepped closer to the railing and looked out across the city. "I have lived here my whole life," she said softly, "and I have never seen it like this." Daniel leaned lightly against the railing beside her. "You see a different city when you are high enough above the noise." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of music and laughter drifted faintly through the open doors behind them, while the quiet city stretched endlessly in front of them. Sophie finally turned toward him. "Can I ask you something honest?" Daniel nodded. "Why did you really choose me tonight?" Sophie continued. "You said it was because I did not recognize your name. But you could have hired an actress. Someone trained to perform in rooms like that." Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. "Because actresses perform," he said slowly. "You do not." Sophie tilted her head slightly, unsure what he meant. Daniel looked back toward the ballroom, where hundreds of wealthy guests continued their polished conversations. "Most people in that room are excellent performers," he explained. "They know exactly what to say, how to smile, how to make every word sound impressive." His voice softened slightly as he looked back at Sophie. "You ask real questions." Sophie looked down at the city lights again, thinking about his words. "Real questions can make powerful people uncomfortable." Daniel smiled faintly. "Sometimes that is exactly what the world needs." A quiet breeze moved across the balcony, gently lifting the edge of Sophie's gown. She rested her hands lightly on the railing and stared out at the glowing skyline. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "this might be the strangest night of my life." Daniel laughed quietly beside her. "Mine too." For a moment their eyes met in the soft balcony light, and something unspoken passed between them. It was not part of the arrangement they had made earlier that evening. It was something quieter, something unexpected, slowly beginning to grow between a billionaire who had spent years surrounded by performance and a woman who had never learned how to pretend. When Sophie Bennett and Daniel Carter stepped back into the ballroom, the energy inside the room had shifted again. The orchestra continued to play its smooth melody, and glasses still clinked politely across the tables. But there was a new tension floating quietly in the air. Several members of Daniel's board were gathered near the stage, speaking in low voices while occasionally glancing toward him. Sophie noticed it immediately. Something changed, she murmured quietly as they walked across the floor. Daniel followed her gaze and understood at once. It usually does, he replied calmly. News travels quickly in rooms like this. Before Sophie could ask what he meant, a familiar voice interrupted from across the room. Daniel, what an unexpected surprise. Both of them turned. Walking toward them with slow, confident steps was a woman dressed in a deep red evening gown that shimmered beneath the chandeliers. Her posture was elegant, her expression controlled, but the sharp curiosity in her eyes was impossible to miss. Sophie instinctively sensed this was not just another guest. The woman stopped a few feet away and folded her hands lightly in front of her. You arrived later than usual, she said smoothly. Then her gaze shifted to Sophie. And with company. Daniel's voice remained steady. Sophie Bennett, this is Victoria Harrison. Sophie immediately understood the significance of the name. Harrison, the powerful family Daniel had mentioned earlier in the car. Victoria offered a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. So this is the woman the entire ballroom has been whispering about tonight. Sophie returned the smile calmly. It seems word travels quickly. Victoria studied her more carefully now, as if searching for something beneath the surface. Yes, she said slowly. Especially when someone unexpected appears beside one of the most eligible men in New York. Daniel shifted slightly, his tone firmer. Victoria. But she raised a hand gently, stopping him. Oh, Daniel, relax. I am not here to cause a scene. Her eyes returned to Sophie. I am simply curious. Sophie kept her posture steady, even as she felt the room subtly quieting around them. Nearby conversation slowed as guests sensed something interesting unfolding. Victoria tilted her head slightly. Tell me, Sophie, she continued sweetly. How long have you and Daniel been engaged? Sophie felt the weight of every eye in the room now. This was the moment the performance truly mattered. She placed her hand lightly on Daniel's arm and answered with calm confidence. Long enough to know he prefers honest conversations over political arrangements. A few nearby guests exchanged surprised glances. Victoria's smile tightened slightly. That is a very bold answer. Sophie met her gaze without hesitation. Honesty usually is. For a moment silence hung between them. Then Victoria reached into her small clutch purse and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. She held it between two fingers before letting it unfold slowly. Interesting, she said softly. Because according to this contract signed earlier today, someone in this room agreed to be a bride for one night. A ripple of shocked whispers spread instantly across the ballroom. Sophie felt Daniel's arm tense slightly beside her. Victoria's voice remained smooth as silk. $10,000, she continued, reading from the page. In exchange for pretending to be Daniel Carter's fiancée during tonight's event. Gasps quietly echoed through the crowd now. Sophie's heart pounded as the truth she had agreed to hide suddenly stood exposed in front of hundreds of powerful guests. Victoria lowered the paper and smiled slowly. So the real question is not who you are, Sophie Bennett. She looked directly into Sophie's eyes. The real question is whether Daniel Carter's bride is real, or just another transaction. For a moment the ballroom felt completely silent. The orchestra had stopped playing, the conversations had faded, and every pair of eyes in the room focused on the folded contract in Victoria Harrison's hand. Sophie Bennett could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. The whispers spreading through the crowd sounded like waves moving across water. Some guests looked shocked. Others looked amused. A few seemed almost relieved, as if the strange mystery of the evening had finally been explained. Victoria watched Sophie carefully, clearly expecting her confidence to collapse under the pressure. Daniel Carter stepped forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. Victoria, that document was never meant to, but Sophie gently touched his arm before he could finish. Her movement was small, but it stopped him immediately. She took one slow breath and stepped forward into the center of the room, where the light from the chandeliers fell clearly across her face. Her heart was racing, but her voice remained steady. She is not wrong, Sophie said quietly. The words rippled through the crowd like a sudden spark. Victoria's eyebrows lifted with satisfaction, as if she had just proven her point. So you admit it, she said smoothly. Sophie nodded once. Yes. The murmurs grew louder now as people leaned closer to hear what would come next. Sophie looked around the ballroom slowly, meeting the curious faces of people who had spent their entire lives surrounded by wealth and influence. Daniel offered me $10,000 tonight, she continued, and I agreed to pretend to be his fiancée. A few guests shook their heads. Others whispered to each other. Victoria crossed her arms calmly, clearly enjoying the moment. Well, she said, at least you are honest. Sophie turned toward her. But the part you forgot to mention, she added softly, is why. Victoria's smile faded slightly. Sophie continued speaking, her voice growing stronger with every word. When Daniel walked into the bar where I work tonight, I had just finished a 12-hour shift. I was worried about paying rent. I was worried about my mother's hospital bills. I was worried about whether I would still have a job next month. She paused, letting the room absorb her words. $10,000 sounded like a miracle. The ballroom remained completely quiet now. Sophie glanced briefly at Daniel before continuing. But somewhere between that bar and this ballroom something changed. She looked back toward the crowd. I realized this room is full of people who spend their lives negotiating power, influence, and control. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Sophie's voice remained calm. And tonight I watched Daniel choose something different. Victoria scoffed lightly. You call this different? Sophie nodded. Yes, because he could have chosen the safe path. He could have married into the Harrison family and secured every business deal waiting for him tomorrow morning. Her eyes moved across the crowd. Instead, he walked into a neighborhood bar and trusted a stranger. For the first time since the confrontation began, uncertainty flickered across Victoria's expression. Sophie turned back toward her. You wanted to know if I am a real bride or a transaction. She smiled faintly. Tonight started as a transaction. But something real happened anyway. The room remained silent as Sophie gently slipped the elegant engagement ring from her finger and placed it on the nearby table. She looked at Daniel, her voice softer now. You hired me to pretend for one night, she said quietly. And I did my best. Then she took a small step back. But real feelings cannot be part of a contract. Without waiting for anyone to respond, Sophie turned and walked slowly toward the ballroom exit. Guests parted quietly to let her pass, their expressions thoughtful and uncertain. Daniel remained standing in the center of the room, staring after her as the echo of her words settled over the crowd. Daniel Carter remained standing in the center of the ballroom long after Sophie Bennett disappeared through the tall doors at the far end of the room. For several seconds no one spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument could have been. The elegant chandelier lights continued to glow above the guests, but the entire atmosphere of the Carter Foundation Gala had changed. Daniel slowly turned his head and looked around the room. The same people who had spent the evening discussing investments, partnerships, and influence now stood quietly watching him. Some looked uncomfortable, others thoughtful. A few seemed almost impressed. Victoria Harrison still held the folded contract in her hand, though the confidence that had filled her expression earlier had faded slightly. Daniel reached toward the nearby table and picked up the ring Sophie had placed there. The diamond caught the light as he held it between his fingers. For a moment he stared at it in silence, remembering the way Sophie had looked earlier when she first stepped into the ballroom. Not nervous, not greedy, just honest. Then he looked up again. The contract is real, Daniel said calmly to the room. The murmurs began again, but Daniel raised his hand slightly, and the room quieted once more. But Sophie Bennett was never the transaction. He paused, letting the words settle. The transaction was my mistake. Victoria's voice returned carefully. Daniel, you do not have to explain yourself to. No, Daniel said gently but firmly. Tonight I do. He looked across the crowd at the board members standing near the stage. For years I have made decisions based on what this room expected from me. Partnerships that strengthened the company. Alliances that protected our position. His voice remained steady. But tonight I realized something important. Daniel glanced once more toward the ballroom doors where Sophie had left. None of those decisions ever required courage. The room remained completely silent now. Even Victoria said nothing. Daniel placed the ring carefully into his pocket. Excuse me, he said simply. Then he turned and walked quickly toward the exit. Outside the hotel the night air felt colder than before, the city streets glowing beneath rows of streetlights. Sophie Bennett had already reached the sidewalk and was walking toward the subway entrance at the end of the block when she heard footsteps behind her. She slowed but did not turn around immediately. Sophie, Daniel called. She stopped then and faced him. The elegant gown moved softly in the night breeze as the sounds of Manhattan traffic echoed around them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel stepped closer, his voice quieter now than it had been in the ballroom. You were right. Sophie looked at him with tired eyes. About what? Real feelings cannot be part of a contract. Sophie folded her arms lightly, unsure what to say. Daniel reached into his pocket and held out the ring again. This was never supposed to mean anything tonight, he said. But somewhere between the bar, the car ride, the balcony, and that ballroom, it started to. Sophie studied his face carefully. You hired me to pretend, she reminded him gently. Daniel nodded. Yes. He paused before continuing. But I am asking you now without any contract, without any payment, and without any expectations. He held the ring between them. Would you consider giving this another chance? Sophie looked at the ring, then back at Daniel. The city lights reflected softly in her eyes as she considered everything that had happened during the strangest night of her life. Finally, a small smile appeared on her face. You realize, she said quietly, this might still be the worst business decision you have ever made. Daniel smiled back. Probably. Sophie stepped a little closer. But it might also be the first honest one. Daniel slipped the ring gently back onto her finger, not as part of an arrangement, but as the beginning of something neither of them had expected when the night began.